A warm welcome to all of you. It is not surprising, but it's very nice to have so many people here. And beyond that door there's another crowd of people. So they, if they can see me, I hope they can, are also very welcome. And may I just say to those people in the overflow upper gallery that when it comes to questions, if any of you want to ask questions, do come to the door there. On to the evening. We are really quite seriously doubly blessed by this evening because of the occasion and the speaker. We, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, do a lot of things in international affairs. I won't list them all, but we have a lot of arrangements with similar academies around the world. We have exchanges of scholars and academics. We have bursary systems. We maintain contact around the world in the academic world of academies like our own. And it's a very important part of our activities, added on to what we do, like lectures like this, advice on policy affairs in Scotland, for the Scottish Government and Parliament, sometimes when they ask for it and sometimes when they don't ask for it, and perhaps they'd rather not have it, but they get it anyhow. Neil McCormick fits into that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The occasion, these lectures, they were originally the European Lectures, and then they have been called, since 2008, the McCormick Lectures. And very rightly too, I think, because of who he was and what he did here at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Most of you will know of him. Many of you, I'm sure, will know him. Educated at Glasgow, then at Balliol College, Oxford, a background which he shares with our speaker tonight. A fellow of Balliol, became Regius Professor of Public Law at Edinburgh University, became very active because it fitted into his genes, literally, in politics. He became an MEP in the Scottish National Party interest. He was very interested in the activities of the Scottish National Party and was called by somebody, I thought, a passionate gradualist, which I think really described him very well. He was a great man in every sense of the word. He was a very effective man, and he was a very much loved man. And it's very nice indeed to have Lady McCormick, Flora McCormick, here with us tonight to help us celebrate his memory with these lectures. I said we're doubly blessed because we do have somebody this evening who is an ideal speaker for this series. In Chris Patten, Lord Patten of Barnes. Again, very well known to everybody, so I won't go into a long history, but a Minister for Overseas Development in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, long experience within the Conservative Party, Chairman of the Conservative Party, MP for Bath, a period as Governor of Hong Kong, which you can't blame anybody for enjoying, I think, going on after that to work in Europe as European Commissioner for External Relations, and then extremely active since then in many ways, very active in Northern Ireland with policing affairs, terribly important job, very active now, and amongst many, many other things, Chancellor of the University of Oxford. So we are very pleased indeed to have Chris Patten with us tonight, and the format will be the usual one. There will be a talk. There will then be an opportunity for questions, and then after that there will be a wine reception upstairs. And without more ado, Chris, if I could invite you, please, to speak.
Lady McCormick, Lord Wilson, ladies and gentlemen, can I first of all thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come back to Edinburgh, which I've visited, thanks to Pope Benedict, several times this year, to give a lecture in Neil's name. Neil arrived at Balliol as a Snell Scholar in my second year in college, and it's fair to say that he took the college and Oxford by storm. Not just because he played the bagpipes, and not just because he ascended effortlessly, as we liked to say at Balliol, to all the most dizzying Oxford peaks. He got a brilliant first in jurisprudence in just 2 years, despite oversleeping and missing the first half hour or an hour of one of his exams, a point of which he was particularly proud. He was president of the Union, and I think above all he showed then what was to be a lifelong characteristic. He had a genius for making friends. Now, you know better than I do his extraordinary achievements, which David Wilson alluded to in Scottish public life, in politics, and in the academy. He was rightly regarded as one of Edinburgh University's treasures. I saw him on the European stage, one of Scotland's members of the European Parliament, certainly one of the jewels in that curious institution's crown. He displayed then, I think, I've alluded to this, he displayed then one of his greatest qualities, the ability to discuss and debate vigorously but without rancour. He didn't think the worse of you if you had an honest difference of opinion. It reminded me of that very wise observation of G.K. Chesterton. The problem, he once said, the problem about a quarrel is that it ends a good argument. Neil was, as David Wilson said, a fine man, and it's, I repeat myself, a privilege to deliver a lecture that bears his name. Both Neil and I were strong supporters of the idea that Scotland and the United Kingdom should play an active and positive role in the European Union. But what exactly is this coming together of nation states that we both believed, Neil and I, to be so important for our countries, for our continent, and for our world? The former Italian Prime Minister, or the different man from the present Italian Prime Minister, Giuliano Amato, a distinguished lawyer, once described the European Union as an unidentified flying object. We had some vague idea where it came from, but no idea at all where it was going. And it is indeed a remarkable creation for two reasons, the second of which to some extent explains the creation. The first reason is that nation states themselves in Europe came together individually so late. Graham Robb's entertaining book, The Discovery of France, reminds us that not until very late in the 19th century was France properly mapped, and that it took even longer for its language to penetrate every part of the country. But the more important reason for surprise is the one, as I said, which perhaps explains the fact that the common market and then the European Union happened at all. Ours is a continent that was torn apart by 3 conflicts in 70 years. The Franco-Prussian War and the 2 world wars of this century. Tens of millions of men, women and children lost their lives. My 2 predecessors as Chancellors of Oxford, Harold Macmillan and Roy Jenkins, both had their ideas of Europe shaped by the fact that they fought in those 2 wars. In my own college, in Neil's college at Oxford, there is a memorial to the dead of those two wars, which lists in alphabetical order the English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, the people from the Dominions, the people from America who'd been at the college, and also the Germans. And for Harold Macmillan, for Roy Jenkins, there was an immorality that, in a sense, reactions against shaped their lives, an immorality about bringing together young men and not many young women in those days, but young men to learn about the humanities, to learn about Western civilization, and then to see them return to their own countries to be taught to murder one another. So war was, in a real sense, the reason for the creation of the European Union. After the First World War, America returned home despite Woodrow Wilson's attempts to establish a new European and a new global order. And Europe got sucked into a Second World War. America was not too happy about staying behind again, but it did so on condition that Europe put xenophobic nationalism behind it. It stayed behind on the understanding that Europe would engage in economic and political integration, which would make another European civil war unlikely, indeed impossible. We very often, I think, misunderstand what happened with the formation of both NATO and the coal and steel community, the common market, what became the European Union. We think that the European structures were entirely our creation and that NATO was imposed on us by the United States. It's almost exactly the reverse of the truth. We were desperately keen for the Americans to stay behind at a time when it was said that the only thing that the Russian armed forces would need to get to the North Sea was their boots. Very keen that the Americans should stay behind and provide Western European democracies with a shield. And the American price for that was for us to press ahead with the European integration which had been sold to them by Jean Monnet and others in Washington in the last years of the Second World War. Jean Monnet was always much better received in Washington than he was in London. A very strong part of America's strategic thinking as the Second World War drew to a close was the idea that Europe should be rebuilt in order that Europeans could help America share the burdens of global leadership in the years after the Second World War. Well, as we know, the United Kingdom held back from the enterprise. Monnet again, regarded Britain's attitude to Europe as the price we paid for winning the war. Churchill, for example, was very enthusiastic about European unity. He thought it would be very good for Europe. But he didn't include the United Kingdom in the Europe which he described. Churchill, and to some extent, it's a view which prevails to the present day, just as General de Gaulle left a mark on French attitudes to France's position in the world, which still obtains. So the same is, to a considerable extent, true of Churchill. Churchill saw us as standing at the heart of three rings of influence, the Lord of the Rings, the United States, Europe, and the Commonwealth with the United Kingdom at its head. We would be Washington's trusted subaltern, a view which I think Mr. Blair shared to some extent as well. We were non-believers as Europe created all sorts of structures that we were absolutely convinced couldn't possibly last. We were patronizing skeptics. And that was true right across parties, with the exception of the Liberals and I think many in the Scottish Nationalist Party. It was certainly true of Labour as well as the Conservatives. Reacting to some early proposals for the development of the Council of Europe, not the most terrifying institution ever created by humankind, Ernie Bevan remarked, "Open that Pandora's box," he said, "and you never know what Trojan horses will jump out." Well, in the event, after the attempt to create an alternative to the European Common Market, as it then was, the European Free Trade Area, after that attempt had failed, we joined. We joined late. We joined after the institutions and personality of the European Union had already taken shape, bearing a very distinct French imprint. But some of our early suspicions about the whole European enterprise remained. Europe was seen very often, and still is seen very often, not only in the tabloids, generally I think in the newspapers owned by Mr. Murdoch, which are nationalist about every issue except the ownership of the media. Europe has been seen as a conspiracy to rob us of our national heritage. We suspect that nefarious federasts will arrive under cover of dark to pilfer parts of that national heritage. A corner of the Albert Memorial here, a pediment from the New Town there. When I went to Brussels as a European Commissioner, the Daily Telegraph had an editorial saying that I had turned my back on the British way of life. There would be no more Marmite, no more Wall's sausages, no more Cadbury's dairy milk, probably no more Queen. The reality, of course, has been very different. Almost 40 years after we joined the European Union, Douglas Hurd remarked, for him rather waspishly, that nothing much seemed to have changed. We still drank our beer warm. The Queen was still on the throne, and her head was still in our banknotes. And we still went to war at the behest of American presidents. So what fundamentally had changed regarding our national sovereignty? Certainly, we haven't seen the creation of a superpower. Mr. Blair once suggested that Europe could become that. Not my view. Nor have we seen the creation of a superstate. The chairman of the European Convention, which produced what became eventually the Lisbon Treaty, setting out the new institutional arrangements for a European Union of 27 member states, The chairman of that convention, Giscard d'Estaing, once compared the work he was doing and the work that his colleagues were doing in the convention to the work of the founding fathers of the United States in drawing up the Constitution of the United States at the end of the 18th century. Well, it was, of course, vainglorious. It was Giscard after all. Lord Carrington tells a story about welcoming Giscard when he was president to a European Council meeting which was being held in Blenheim Palace. And he met Giscard in the Great Hall of Blenheim and took Giscard's coat, which was flung like one of those Italian conductors over his shoulders. And Giscard paused and looked around and said, "What a very large house for a very small battle." So allow for a little vainglory. But it's also, I think, true that there is a fundamental difference between what happened in Philadelphia and what happened in Brussels. In Philadelphia, subnational entities were coming together to found a nation state, which actually still took them quite a few years. In Europe, what happened was that proud nation states came together to see how much sovereignty they were prepared to share, to see whether they could transform their sovereignty in that enterprise, and to decide how they could manage the process of sovereignty sharing and manage the institutions which would actually be politically accountable for that whole enterprise. The American Constitution begins with the words, "We the people." Europe's constitutional treaty begins, "the King of the Belgians." And it goes on to list the heads of state of the other 26 member states of the European Union. In Europe, legitimization lies with democratically elected national governments. Nevertheless, what's been achieved in Europe in terms of sovereignty sharing is remarkable. I can't think of another example of states agreeing to pool sovereignty to this extent, nor to them accepting binding dispute settlement machinery on the scale which has happened in Europe. The process can be thunderingly prosaic, but that's always been true of diplomacy. The first article of the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France, signed in 1904, deals with the French right to fill the job of Director of Antiquities in Egypt. So the prosaic has always had a part in diplomacy. But we have created the largest single market of diverse nation states, the largest trading bloc in the world which negotiates as one, and the largest common environment policy. Much of the debate on geostrategy these days ignores Europe almost completely, or downplays the significance of Europe. And in many respects, that's a bit of a surprise. Europe has 7% of the world's population and 22% of the world's output. That's more than twice as much as China. It's more than the United States. It's 4 to 5 times as much as India. It's a lot more than Japan. It's also interesting to look at another statistic, the impact on Europe of the re-emergence, I say re-emergence deliberately, of China's economic clout. In the decade after 1999, China increased its share of world exports from 5.1 to 12.4%. Who lost out? The United States' share of world exports fell from 18% to under 12%. Japan lost 4%, not as much as America's almost 7%. Europe only lost 2.4%, going down from 19 to 16.6%. So we're not quite as clapped out as we're sometimes made out to be. The ability to project yourself on the world stage depends, of course, to a considerable extent on economic success. The United Kingdom was at its most powerful and dominant from the 1830s, 1840s to the 1870s, when we were responsible for about 30% of world output. And when people question Europe's ability to pack much of a punch in the world, that's the sort of figure looking forward that they consider: output, trade, size. During the 19th century, one reason why Europe was so dominant was that our share of the world's population increased from a fifth to a quarter. That led to the great waves of emigration to other parts of the world, and it helped lead to the world wars, to the wars that I've already mentioned. But Europe's population today is likely to fall by about 20% by mid-century. There are particularly steep falls in Italy, Spain, and Poland, which raises interesting questions. Moreover, there is an aging population and a growing dependency rate. We're used to each generation being bigger than the one before. In most European countries, that will not be true in the first half of this century. At the same time, we have a much lower growth rate, underlying growth rate, than either the United States or the emerging economies of Latin America and, of course, Asia. So European heads of government have committed themselves twice now to doing something about this. They agreed in the year 2000 in Lisbon. They agreed a program which they argued would make Europe the most competitive knowledge-based economy. I pass by the fact that ignorance-based economies don't have much of a record. The most competitive knowledge-based economy in the world by 2010. Didn't quite achieve that, so in 2010 they agreed on another program which would make Europe the most competitive knowledge-based economy by 2020. Mr. Juncker, the chairman of the Eurozone Council of Ministers, said defensively the other day, of course, he said, we know what needs to be done to increase Europe's growth rate. We just don't know how we'd get re-elected if we did it. It's called leadership. The problem that Europe has is that we think, and we're probably correct to think it, that we have the best quality of life in the world. And we fear that any change in our policies will threaten that quality. Many people have taken it as read that entitlements are there for all time. There's a wonderful Italian political novel called The Leopard by Giuseppe Lampedusa, in which one of the characters, Tancredi, says, got it almost right. Things have to change in order to remain the same. And that is not widely accepted in Europe these days. So the danger we face is one in which we have a falling share of the world's population, and unless we do something about our underlying growth rate, a falling share as well of world trade and world output. And that would not be a very good basis for trying to project European influence or European power, whether hard or soft. But that's what Europe has increasingly insisted that it wants to do. There was a growing view in the 1980s and 1990s that Europe had become an economic giant, but politically was a seven-stone weakling. And it was argued that we should do something to get closer to being a political Charles Atlas as well as an economic one. What in particular triggered this sentiment? I think two events, or series of events, and one growing comprehension. The first of the events was the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia's European empire, which left us with a strong sense that it was time for Europe to take a bigger role in our own continent's affairs and internationally. The second event was the disintegration of Yugoslavia in the 1980s and 90s, during which Europe couldn't decide whether it was in favor of the dismemberment of Yugoslavia or was against the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, or didn't want to have to think about the dismemberment of Yugoslavia. And while we stood on the sidelines, 200,000 Bosnians were slaughtered. Ethnic cleansing returned to Europe, and concentration camps returned to Europe. It wasn't glorious, and Europe decided that the same thing should never happen again. The perception was, I think, this: the recognition that while nation states remain the building blocks of international society, nation states can't on their own cope with the global problems that crowd in on us. It's self-evidently true for smaller and medium-sized states. It's self-evidently true even for states like Britain and France, which have a permanent seat in the Security Council of the UN because of what we were in the 1940s, which have our own independent, which have our own nuclear deterrence, and which have a global diplomatic reach. Even for us, it's true that we don't matter greatly on our own. Britain talks about its special relationship with the United States, but we're always much more useful for the United States when we're at the heart of a European enterprise, and preferably leading a European enterprise. So there were a succession of meetings and treaties in the 1990s and the noughties, Maastricht, Amsterdam, Lisbon. We put in place an institutional framework for establishing a common, not a single, but a common foreign and security policy. And some people suggested that we'd answered Henry Kissinger's question, the famous question that Kissinger once asked, though he denies it, if I want to know what Europe thinks, who do I phone? Well, we now have an extremely high representative, Lady Ashton, sometimes talked of as Europe's foreign minister. We have a president of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy. So perhaps Dr. Kissinger should phone them, except that there are also 27 prime ministers and 27 foreign ministers and 27 foreign ministries. And we know that foreign policy, security policy, go right to the heart of what it means to be a nation state. There are bureaucratic problems in constructing a common foreign and security policy. On the whole, you need in foreign policy to reach decisions quickly, and that's difficult with 27 foreign ministries and governments. And you also need political will. There is a danger in Europe that we think that all that matters is institution building. What matters most is the political will to make something of the institutions. So the fact that we don't have a more pronounced or more successful foreign policy isn't the fault of Lady Ashton, it's the fault of the member states. We have in Europe a foreign policy which is terrifically expressed in endless communiques. We are establishing at the moment a European External Action Service. I was saying to somebody earlier today that I think the word action in that heading is what Gilbert Ryle and other philosophers might have called a category error. Europe is terrific at communiques which are traditionally full of extremely strong nouns and extremely weak verbs. We have produced this year, I counted, we have produced this year in Europe 22 different statements on the Middle East. But even somebody who follows these matters as I do would find it very difficult to say exactly what Europe's position on the Middle East was. Part of the reason for the will is because, as an American academic pointed out recently, Europe is Venus, America is Mars. It wasn't so recent, it was during the Iraq War. And I think that's a fair description. We are very often reluctant to accept the importance of the use of force in order to sustain the international rule of law. But I'm not sure that's a bad thing for the rest of the world when I look back at the last century. This time last year, I was in the South Island of New Zealand. I visited Queenstown, partly because it's near the Pinot Noir of Central Otago. And you drive up to the end of a wonderful lake to the north of Queenstown and get into the Lord of the Rings country. And I was in a tiny village, about as far, I imagine, as you could get from Picardy in Flanders, and looked at the cemetery in the village and the war memorial. And there were 26 New Zealand names, 26 New Zealanders who'd been killed in a war the other side of the globe. So I think the rest of the world paid a pretty high price when Europe was Mars. My grandparents and parents and yours used to worry about the amount that Germany spent on weapons. We now worry that Germany doesn't spend enough on weapons. And I think on balance, that's a rather better world. If we're serious, let me give you a list. If we're serious on developing a common foreign and security policy, what should be our guidelines? Well, the first issue is simple. It's much easier to develop a serious external policy when you have a serious internal policy. This should make it easier, for example, to have a more concerted position on international economic affairs when we're dealing with some of the emerging powers. I fear that's not true in dealing with China or India or Brazil or others. The European Union has been very reluctant to cede leadership in these areas to one authority rather than pursuing these matters member state by member state. So that there is, for example, in our relations with China, a European dialogue at the European Union level. There are also either 5 or 6 other European dialogues at the level of member states. It confuses the Chinese, who actually, I sometimes used to think, believed rather more strongly in the European Union than we do. Where we don't have an internal policy, how can we have an external policy? That's the reason why we don't have a European policy on Russia. Russia has used the energy weapon to pursue the establishment, rather like the beginning of the 19th century, to establish a sphere of influence around its borders, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, the Baltic states. We should have reacted to that by establishing a single European energy policy. This is an area where, paradoxically, it's the United Kingdom which has been pressing for more Europe, and Germany, Italy and others who've been dragging their feet because they still want to support national champions who cut deals with Gazprom, whatever the political consequences. So no European energy policy, no policy, no coherent policy on Russia. Secondly, European policy externally is always going to be most effective the nearer it is to home. We're at our best in our own neighbourhood, and we're at our worst too, as it happens. The most successful European foreign policy that we've followed over the years has been the enlargement of the European Union. We have sustained regime change, to use a Bushism, partly by our own example and partly by offering membership of the European Union to the countries of our continent or the countries around our borders. When Greece, Spain, Portugal threw off fascist authoritarian governments, we offered them membership of the European Union in order to consolidate democracy in those countries. When Russia's European empire fell to pieces, we offered the countries of Central and European and Eastern Europe membership of the European Union. We provided them with assistance as well in making the reforms which were necessary to become members, and that led to the huge expansion in the EU in 2004. The fact that the dismantling of Russia's empire was managed on the whole peacefully, except in the Balkans, was not a given beforehand. I think European policy helped to achieve that. In the Balkans, we now have a policy which has brought some stability to the region through offering countries in the West Balkans the prospect of membership of the European Union if they make the sort of changes which, in our view, would sustain the rule of law, would lead to open markets and consolidate democracy. And Croatia, for instance, is well on the way to becoming an EU member. But a policy that succeeded is now doubted by many, and we're undoubtedly suffering from enlargement fatigue in the European Union. The most serious casualty of that is probably Turkey, which we've been negotiating with for decades, pressing the Turks to introduce reforms which would which would underpin democracy, underpin welfare capitalism, protect people's civil liberties and human rights. And we've said to Turkey, if you continue to the end of this path, then you can become members of the European Union. Turkey, for me, is an existential issue in the future of Europe. Turkey would be a hugely important energy hub for Europe. It's a very important security player with large and very professional armed forces. It has influence from Central Asia to the Mediterranean shores of the Middle East. It's a secular Islamic country doing all the things which we would like other Islamic countries to do. If at the end of the process of negotiation we accede to the prejudices, for example, of President Sarkozy and still deny Turkey membership of the European Union, I think it will be very difficult for us to be treated seriously as players on the geostrategic stage, and I think we will have been seen to burn bridges between the traditional West and the Islamic world rather than build them. Third point, and I'll deal with it briefly, is we've often in the past defined our Europeanness or defined European policies either in contradistinction to those of the United States, or we've defined them as ways in which we could accede to the demands of the United States. And I think you can see both those positions very clearly, particularly in attitudes in Europe to the extravagant unipolar view of the Bush years. What we should do is recognize, for example, that the reason for opposing nuclear proliferation in Iran is because of its impact on us, as well as on America and the rest of the world. We want to try to sustain some sort of stability and democracy in Pakistan because of the impact, if we don't do so, on us, as well as our impact on the region and on the rest of the world. We have, I think, to be much clearer about our own interests. It's true, for example, as well, of the Middle East. Europe is the largest trade partner of Israel in the world and the largest provider of development assistance to Palestine. Our policy on the Middle East for some years has been to support whatever the United States was doing. That was sometimes embarrassing when the United States was doing nothing, and it's not necessarily very helpful when the United States is pursuing policies which aren't getting anywhere. We're part of what is called the Quartet on the Middle East: the United States, Europe, Russia, and the UN, which is supposed to be supervising movement through the peace process. The Secretary General of the Arab League has very properly described the Quartet as the Quartet sans toi. And while there are important things we could and should do as Europeans in the Middle East, we've simply settled for the job of holding America's coat. Penultimate point I want to make is that we should rein in our rhetoric about what we tell people we're able to do, when the rhetoric is so different from what we're actually prepared to do or able to do. That's perhaps particularly so in the defence and security field. It's not that we don't spend quite a bit on defence. We have in uniform about 500,000 more men and women than the United States. We spend 200 billion in Europe on defence, but we spend it extremely badly. Almost 70% of our forces are unable to operate outside our national territory in the sort of places where they may actually be needed. We don't have enough helicopters, we don't have enough transport aircraft. If we were to want to deploy peacekeepers in any large numbers to, say, Africa next week, we would have to go to the Ukraine to lease aircraft from them. So we need to bring into rather closer approximation what we tell the world we can do and what we're capable of doing. Finally, I think for Europe to be effective internationally in developing some sort of common foreign policy, we have to understand that unlike the United States, we don't matter everywhere, but we could matter in some places a lot. I think Europe should be particularly concerned to help develop a greater stability in Africa. We are the largest provider of development assistance in the world, and I think we should add our diplomatic clout and political clout to the amount of money that we spend. Africa has the longest running war fighting in the world in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has seen more deaths than in any other country since the Second World War. And I fear that the next threat we will see on our horizon is in Sudan, not this time in relation to Darfur, but between the north, the Muslim north, and the Christian south, after the referendum in the south in January on the possibility of the south becoming independent. I've said why I think Europe should have a more developed foreign policy, and I've suggested some of the guidelines which I think we should follow in developing one. I'm sorry that it's meant that I've engaged in a sort of tour d'horizon, or what Dennis Healy used to call a tour de gloss. I certainly don't want to make any extravagant claims for what has been achieved or what could be achieved. Groucho Marx once said, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? You know what your own eyes tell you, and I don't think you'd take any old nonsense from me on the subject. But I do believe, finally, I do believe that both past experience and present and future necessity should encourage us to try harder to develop a greater European dimension to foreign policy. Samuel Coleridge lamented, if men could learn from history, what lessons it might teach us. But passion, he went on, but passion and party blind our eyes, and the light which experience gives us is a lantern on the stern, which shines only on the waves behind us. The image is compelling and I think particularly beautiful, but the message is actually wrong. Seeing the state of the sea behind us gives us at least some idea of what the sea will be like ahead. That's what informed the creation of the European Union in the first place, after all. I believe that what we can actually glean in the dark from the light on the stern, what we can learn for our own history, should be a valuable guide to present and future policy. And I certainly hope it will guide European heads of government and foreign ministers in shaping a more effective international policy for Europe in the years ahead. But I'm not holding my breath. Thank you very much indeed.
Chris, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating and sporadically amusing discourse. Thank you very much. We've got about 20 minutes for questions. There are, usual thing, there are microphones on both sides which will move up and down the room. Could I, as usual, also encourage people to speak briefly, i.e. to ask questions and not give lectures? If there are, as I said at the beginning, people next door in the upper gallery who'd like to ask questions, do please come to the door. Lastly, I think it's quite helpful to Chris Patten, to Lord Patten, answering questions if people say who they are, and if they come from a particular organisation, that's also quite helpful background. So who would like to start? I think somewhere on the right. Yes, thank you very much. And then there was somebody coming up there.
I have a question on, given that Patrick Corbett from Heriot Watt, I have a question on, with David Cameron there in China and your experience in China and dealing with China. When you look back from the stern of Hong Kong and you see a different China, looking forward, we see a very different China. What would be your advice to him in how he deals with his interaction with a China that is growing very rapidly?
It's the second visit like this that David Cameron has made. The first one he made was to India at the end of July. And I think he deliberately went to India before China. Not because he doesn't want a good relationship with China, but because there is inevitably, in my view, a qualitative difference in our relationship with China and India. There's no difference in the value system when you're talking to an Indian minister. If you suggested a human rights dialogue with the Indians, they would be appalled at the notion, and to some extent rightly. But there isn't that sharing of values with China. Nevertheless, as I said, we should want as positive a relationship with China as we can manage, and while remaining realistic, we should be among those who encourage China to take a responsible leadership role in international society. I think it helps. I mean, David is a serious China scholar, so he may disagree with some of this, but I think it helps if you remember that we're not seeing the rise of China as though China hasn't been there for the last several millennia. China has been the largest economy in the world for 18 out of the last 20 centuries. And it will be again in this century. It won't be the largest country for more than another 25, 30 years. India will be larger than China with a younger population by about 2040, when the biggest population in the world will be Indian, and the second biggest population in the world will be Chinese pensioners. We should want China to succeed. China falling apart or doing badly would be very bad for the rest of the world. But you can't help but be a little nervous about how the Chinese leadership manages both its relationship with the United States and its neighbors, how it manages to civilize nationalism, and how it manages the political changes which many Chinese leaders, including Wen Jiabao, the Prime Minister, clearly believe to be necessary as China becomes a more sophisticated economy. And I could go on much longer. I don't think that the gap between Chinese exports to this country and Chinese and British exports to China, which is about 18 billion, is going to be closed by Mr. Cameron's visit, however entrepreneurially brilliant those with him are. I have always, I don't say this in particularly in criticism of this particular trip, but I've always taken the view that these visits are, to some extent, show business. And I'm not sure how much they really affect the underlying economic position of countries. I think the Chinese, this isn't a widely held view, but I think the Chinese do business on the same basis as most of the rest of us. They buy what they want at the best price they can get it for. If they play us off one against the other, if they convince us that we have to associate ourselves with their political positions or curtsy to their political positions, and they get away with that, who can blame them? Because that's the way we on the whole behave. But I don't think that, I mean, there are some people now who suggest that there is a small impact on the exports of those countries whose heads of state or government have met the Dalai Lama. There are a couple of American academics who've done a huge amount of work on all the IMF trade statistics. I'm a bit dubious about all that. So I hope we'll have a good relationship with China, as good as possible. I hope we'll see the academic links that we have with China develop. We've got 740 Chinese students at Oxford. A third of our mathematicians are Chinese. I hope all that will develop. I hope we'll be able to convince the Chinese to dismantle some of the impediments, some of the blockades to investment and exports to China. I hope we'll be able to encourage the Chinese to change their economic model and spend more and allow the renminbi to edge up on the foreign exchanges. And that's the big game, but certainly that's not going to be accomplished by one visit. And the difficulty, the last point I make, the difficulty for any Western leader visiting China is the Chinese assert the importance of being mindful of their face. They're not very good at the face of those who visit. I've never minded making that point to the Chinese myself.
Thanks. We had a question here about 2 rows further forward, and I think there was somebody at the back. I sort of half saw hesitating, put up a hand, and then I'll have 3 rows back.
Lord Patten, I liked your marine analogy. You referred briefly to the prejudices of President Sarkozy. Do you think he's a good member of the crew in repelling borders? I refer, of course, to the spat between France and Germany in mid-September over the Roma people.
No, I feel rather strongly about this. I'm very often at conferences where people talk about Europe being able to export our values to the rest of the world. Well, what do we mean? Do we mean the way that the Italian government have treated the Roma? Do we mean the way the French government have treated the Roma? I think we'd be taken much more seriously around the world if we were less hypocritical and if we were more consistent in the way that we pursued our principles. It's also true that while we rabbit on about the importance of multilateralism, we're not always as good as we should be at keeping our multilateral commitments. So I think a little more humility on this score would be very much in order. I used to be a fierce critic of President Chirac. The last few years I've started to feel better about him.
3 rows back on the left, and then second row on the right, and then second row from the back.
Ian Clement. The elephant in the room, the euro, the single currency, you've never mentioned it. You have Germany, which is a very strong economy. It's engineering, it builds things and sells things. The rest of Europe, with a single straitjacket, it's creating all sorts of tensions and problems because essentially governments, are they not, being politicians, are going to look after their own skins first, and what is best to make sure that they get re-elected or stay in power. So how are you then going to sustain a currency which is in essence going to beggar some countries while allowing others to prosper? Thank you.
Well, I agree with you about the elephant in the room. Let's remember the political reason for the euro. The fall of the Berlin Wall, Chancellor Kohl, I think one of the great figures of the last 50 years. Chancellor Kohl, determined to seize the moment and reunify Germany. Margaret Thatcher, hugely opposed, saying famously she loved Germans so much she wanted to have two Germanys. And Margaret Thatcher thinking that she had François Mitterrand in her camp. And then Mitterrand, in effect, doing a bunk and agreeing to support the reunification of Germany if Germany put the strong Deutsche Mark at the heart of a European currency. Just as the original common market was based on the French or Germany accepting French agriculture and also sharing its steel industry with France. So the basis for a Europe with a united Germany at its heart was the Germans accepting that they would lose their beloved Deutschmark and accept the euro. If that decision had ever gone to a referendum in Germany, it would never, ever have got through. Now, the Germans accepted all that. I'm going to sound more sympathetic to Germany than some of you may think is entirely warranted. The Germans accepted that on the understanding that the weaker economies in Europe, particularly those in southern Europe, would close the gap between their level of competitiveness and German levels of competitiveness by making labour market reforms, by bearing down on unit labour costs, all those things to make their economies more competitive. They didn't do that at all. They took advantage of the fact that they had lower interest rates within the Eurozone than would otherwise have been the case to allow asset bubbles, to increase consumer demand. They had a blowout in Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy to some extent. And then at the end of the day, when the proverbial hit the fan, at the end of the day turned round and said to Germany, you've got to save us from all this. You mustn't save as much. And you must buy more of what we produce and want to export. What are the Germans supposed to buy from Greece? Olives? Shipping? Sunshine? From Spain? From Portugal? I understand it when the Germans say, so the answer to Europe's problems is that other people should be as inefficient as that we should be as inefficient as other people. It's completely crazy. Actually, over the years, Germany has been buying more of its of the things it wants to import from outside the European Union because prices were cheaper. Having said that, it's true that Germany does fantastically well out of the euro because it has a controlled market it can sell to, and it still sells 9 times as much to the rest of the Eurozone as it does to China. It also has, because it's in the Eurozone, a currency to export in which is valued far below what they'd be exporting in if they still had the Deutschmark. If the currency they were trading in just reflected German economic competitiveness and not German, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, French, they wouldn't be exporting so much because the value of the currency would be higher. So while I sympathize with them when they reject criticism of their economic model, I think they have to accept that the costs of a system which has been very good for them do have to be partly borne by their own treasury. That said, the Eurozone is an attempt to make politics triumph over economics. And maybe it'll succeed, maybe it won't. But it's very difficult to run a currency zone if you don't have a fiscal union and if you don't have a united labour market, which is what got Spain and Portugal into this trouble in the first place. The governments of the Eurozone countries are passionately committed to holding on to the euro, and maybe they'll succeed. But if you were, we were saying earlier, if you were the Spanish government outside the euro, and if you want to discover the elephant in the room, try talking about the euro in Spain. Traditionally, a country like Spain would have devalued the currency and inflated. Now, those aren't recipes for success, but they're recipes for avoiding year after year after year of grinding down labour costs, which is what Spain will have to do in order to cover the 25 or 30% competitiveness gap that there is between Spain and Germany.
Second row, and then there's about 3 rows from the back, and then everyone there. Yes, let's go.
Ronald Guild, the escalating piracy of the coast of Somalia and the terrorist threats to aircraft and the whole general terrorist threat seems to highlight the relationship between NATO and the European Union. Could you comment on that relationship as to whether you find it satisfactory?
I don't think that relationship is bad. I think it's true that most European member states don't spend enough on security, and as I said in my remarks, don't spend what they do spend well. And I hope that financial stringency will press European governments into more cooperation over defence procurement, over harmonisation of defence kit and so on. I think that there's a bigger issue behind that, behind your question, and that is that the greatest threats in the world today aren't from strong states. I mean, historically, the threats have been from strong states. The big threats today come from weak states, or from states that are failing, or states that may fail. So Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Burma, not so much Colombia now, but perhaps Mexico. I mean, what is happening in Mexico is appalling. Bang on America's doorstep, and if that doesn't make the National Rifle Association a tad nervous and a tad concerned about the export of guns, the sale of guns, to a country which is murdering by the thousands. It's like the Book of Kings. I mean, it's killing by the 10,000 almost. So I think it's failed and failing states, and we have not got in place the institutions of international governance which provide sufficient credibility or legitimacy for intervening in failed states to secure them or to build institutions in them, let alone to prevent abusive governments murdering their own citizens in large numbers. I gave a very partial list. Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I mentioned in my remarks, Zimbabwe. All these problems which you can't ghettoize, you can't protect the rest of the world by building a wall around them. We know that dramatically in the case of terrorism, but it's true in the case of epidemic disease like AIDS. It's true in the case of drugs. 95% of the heroin which is injected tonight in Edinburgh will come from Afghanistan. Now, we've got a crazy policy on drugs in this country, but that's another matter. So, failed and failing states are, I think, the biggest threat to our stability in the 21st century, buoyed up by a ludicrous sort of Westphalian 19th century view of sovereignty.
Yes, near the back, and then second row from the front on my left. Thank you. And then third row. And then I think that's going to be it, I'm afraid. Right, at the back, please.
Anne Packard, RSA, and a member of the European movement in Scotland. On a slightly light-hearted note, I would like to ask you what advice you would offer our politicians, given that many schools in Scotland do not teach modern studies, so pupils learn relatively little about Europe. And what advice would you offer our politicians to encourage the use of languages? And would you put Chinese ahead of European languages, or where would you place the pecking order?
Boy. Until 1932, I think it was, Oxford University didn't offer a degree course in French or German, because the assumption was that anybody who was intelligent enough to go to university would speak French and German fluently. As, again, G.K. Chesterton put it, the past is not what it was. I think the decline in the study of modern languages in I don't know as much about the schools in Scotland, but in schools in England is a disaster. And I add it, and this will make you think I'm a real Luddite, I add it to my concern about the development of easy subjects as opposed to ones which require more intellectual rigor. It's true in the sciences and maths, as well as it's true about modern languages. So one thing I would hope our politicians would do would be to try to reverse what's been happening with modern languages. And I don't like thinking of the issue entirely in utilitarian terms. We should want more kids, more children to learn Mandarin, not necessarily principally because we want them to become Rolls-Royce marketing men and women in the next 20 years, but because learning a language like Mandarin is an extraordinarily important intellectual discipline and teaches you about another civilization. I mean, of course there are utilitarian reasons for doing these things, but having just been present at the beatification of Cardinal Newman, I'm very conscious of the liberal case for education as well. What should politicians or political leaders do? Well, they should try to encourage more people to go into teaching. They should build on the schemes at present for helping those who've been in another profession and are going to lose their job to move into teaching. They should certainly, as well as reversing the decline in language teaching, try to encourage the teaching as well of history and geography, which have again been rather sidelined. I don't know how people cope with life when they don't know the signposts in our culture and as well as literally in our geography. So Education.
Two more last questions here in the front two rows. Thank you.
John Francis. In the light of your comments about the new European Foreign Secretary, do you think it's desirable to create a European diplomatic service, or is it simply impossible?
It's possible, and I think given the amount that Europe does, which has an external dimension, trade, migration, development, as well as regulatory issues and, to some extent, foreign policy. I think there is a European role there. And I hope the European Action Service, as it's called, will be professionally staffed. I hope it will be budgeted for with the same modesty which attaches to, alas, to all too great an extent to our own foreign service and other people's. I hope this won't be regarded as a chance for a blowout. So I think there's a case for a diplomatic service. There's a nice question about the extent to which we'd be prepared to use it. I mean, if we're going around the world closing embassies and consulates and missions in countries, then we should be perfectly happy about using whatever Europe is doing there, and indeed encouraging political reporting by European missions on the spot. So yeah, I think there's a case for it. Lady Ashton, to do her credit, has done, I think, quite well in getting it as far off the ground as she's managed so far. But I hope she'll be tougher on the budgetary issues, because I think it's going to be extremely annoying for civil servants of member states as well as taxpayers in member states if, when everybody else seems to be pulling in their belt, Europe seems to be letting its out.
Can we take the last question, the third row, please? The lady there.
Christina Anderson, your views on Turkey, you seem to approve building bridges, etc. I think of the very inadequate predictions regarding the levels of Polish immigration a few years ago. I think of the cap or the caps, the methods to cap or curb immigration that don't seem to be working at all, that we've been told about, even the new ones. So Turkey has a very big population. I think a lot of people would want to come here. How would you deal with that?
Well, two things. First of all, there was a huge migration from Poland, and particularly Poland, after Poland became a member of the European Union in 2004. It was particularly large in this country because we, unlike some others, Germans, for example, we accepted that Poland and other countries could become a member of the European Union, and we would agree to free movement of people between their countries and ours. My own life was greatly helped by the arrival of Polish plumbers and others. We never have got a plumber in London if they hadn't arrived from Poland. They've all gone back now because they get better jobs in Poland and they're not paid so much. But I think we did on the whole, on balance, quite well out of that migratory flow. But there is no obligation. I mean, I assume that if Turkey gets into the European Union, it will be with a derogation by the rest of the Union as far as the free movement of labour is concerned. But if you look at what's happening to the population in Italy, for example, Italy is going to need a large number of economically active people in the next few years. And I don't know where they're going to come from. And it's not true here, but it's true of some other countries as well. So I hope we will accept Turkey for other reasons. And I think Turkey would certainly accept that there should be limits on the ability of young Turks to go and work elsewhere. The situation is changing fairly dramatically in Turkey. I think the Turks are now much more questioning about how much they want to join Europe, and in my own view, it's much more obvious that we should want Turkey to join. But the point you raise is an important one. It's part of a more general issue. I think it's possible and desirable even to talk about migration in a grown-up way without indulging in sort of populist rhetoric about it. There is some very nasty populism about on the migration issue. But it's likely to increase unless the conversation that the rest of us have on migration is a bit more grown up. So I think, though there are huge difficulties in talking about immigration caps, I think it's something which is reasonable to talk about and to try to achieve, though not at all easy. My youngest daughter had her first child a couple of years ago in St Mary's Hospital in Paddington, and was the only English speaker on the ward. She's just been to have a scan for her second baby, and she said she thought that the staff fell on her with enthusiasm because they could speak English to her. And I mean, the proportion of Londoners whose parents were born in other countries and with other languages is, I can't remember what it is, but it's huge. And that creates social tensions and economic problems, and we should be grown up about discussing them.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Chris, for answering them all so fully. Could I ask Sir David Edward, who is convener of the International Committee of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which is a role formerly played by Sir Neil McCormick, to propose a vote of thanks?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps I could begin with a reminiscence. When commissioners of the European Union take office, they are required to come down to Luxembourg to take an oath before the Court of Justice. And when the commission of which Chris Patten was a member came down to take the oath, a number of the younger officials in the court said to me, please can you arrange that we can speak to Chris Patten? And they weren't just British, they were from all the member states. Now, the commissioners usually either get straight back into their chauffeur-driven cars and go back to Brussels, or they swan around talking to each other or to the ambassadors. Not so Chris Patten. I asked him, would he like to speak to some of the officials, and he said, of course. And I introduced them to him, and 20 minutes later he was still talking to them. And I think we've seen today why that is so, why people of many countries admire him so much, and why they want to talk to him. He has the capacity to cover the sweep of history and the scope of the world and the problems of the world. He's highly realistic about where we stand and where they stand, but above all, there is a moral element in what he has to say, and I'm sure you'd want to thank him most sincerely for his lecture and for the way in which he's answered the questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Once again, thank you all for coming. There is a wine reception upstairs for those who can stay and don't want to go straight out into the cold. Thank you.